This is the number that stopped the review, 14%. Not 14% of damage, not 14% of the hogs. 14% of what one unmanaged South Texas coyote population was eating turned out to be wild pigs. Not rabbits, not mice, not scraps. Wild pigs. Now hold that next to the accepted story. In Texas, feral hog control has long been framed as a brutal math problem. Bigger traps, more helicopter flights, more rounds, more pressure. You hit the adults because the adults are what you can see. Then a cold pattern model was built from published field data, trail camera behavior, trapping records, reproduction studies, and predator surveys. It was given no story, no politics, no favorite solution. It was asked one question: what actually changes the future of the population? It did not answer the way anyone expected. The image that starts this is simple. A ranch in Texas after a major hog removal operation. Torn soil, broken rows, the smell still in the air, cameras left up to prove the ground had gone quiet. The assumption was that the story was over. The hogs had been hit hard. The pressure had been applied. The landscape should have been buying time. Instead, the footage kept showing movement in the dark. Not more hogs at first. Something else. That is the part almost nobody outside this world thinks about. The aftermath. We talk about the damage. We talk about the body count. We talk about the invasiveness, the cost, the rage farmers feel when they wake up and find a field turned inside out in a single night. But we rarely ask what the land does next. What steps into the gap? What survives the operation? What learns from it? What comes back faster than the people carrying out the plan can reload, refuel, or rebait? That blind spot matters because feral hogs are not just another nuisance animal. They are one of the most successful invasive mammals on the continent. Texas Parks and Wildlife says the U.S. wild pig population climbed from about 2.4 million in 1982 to an estimated 6.9 million by 2016, with roughly 2.6 million of them in Texas alone. They are now established in 253 of Texas's 254 counties. One county left? One. Sit with that. That is not a scattered problem. That is a living front line stretched almost wall to wall across a state. And the reason they spread like that begins centuries earlier, with a decision so practical it barely looked like a decision at all. Spanish expeditions moving through the Gulf region brought pigs with them because pigs were easy to transport, easy to breed, and easy to leave behind as a future food source. Texas A&M's feral hog history records. The pigs were already being left and lost in Texas by the DeSoto expedition in the 1540s, and wild populations were established in parts of Texas by the late 1500s. Then came the second wave. In the 1930s and 1940s, Eurasian wild boar were deliberately introduced on Texas properties, escaped enclosures, hybridized with feral stock, and deepened the problem. That is how you get an animal that feels less like escaped livestock and more like a machine built by accident. It breeds year-round when conditions are good. Texas A&M describes feral hogs as the most prolific large wild mammal in North America. With enough food, a population can double in 4 months. Sows can produce 2 litters in roughly 12 to 15 months. Average litters run 4 to 8 piglets, and older sows can have even more. Now place that against the human timetable. A rancher sees damage after sunrise. A trap is checked the next morning. A helicopter operation has to be scheduled. A county budget has to be approved. A state program has to be staffed. The hog does not live on that timetable. The hog lives on the timetable of reproduction, concealment, and movement. That is why the damage feels supernatural when you read it in one block. A recent crop loss study across 11 states estimated almost $678.8 million in annual wild pig costs tied to 6 major crops. A separate study of livestock producers across 13 states estimated more than $650 million a year in damage and control costs, driven heavily by property damage and rooted up pasture. APHIS now says feral swine damage and control costs in U.S. agriculture are estimated at about $2.5 billion every year. And even those numbers still feel smaller than the thing itself, because dollars flatten reality. A dollar figure does not show you a creek bank collapsed into mud. It does not show you a pasture lifted in strips like a carpet. It does not show you a landowner walking fence at dawn and realizing the night took more than the last month of work. It does not show you how quickly confidence disappears when the same animals keep returning, no matter what you throw at them. So the official explanation, to be fair, was never stupid. It was logical. The accepted model said this is a density problem. Too many hogs. Too much reproduction, too much mobility. The answer then is integrated control. APHIS describes the modern approach as a combination of whole sounder trapping, fencing, ground removal, aerial removal, and other tools selected to fit terrain and local conditions. Texas A&M guidance strongly emphasizes trapping entire sounders, not fragments of them, because these animals are social, intelligent, and fast to adapt. That part matters more than most people realize, because the worst mistake in hog control is not missing a shot. It is teaching a survivor. If you pressure a group badly, but not completely, you do not just leave hogs behind. You leave behind hogs with a lesson. Texas A&M's guidance on trapping makes this brutally clear without ever turning it into drama. Pre-baiting matters, timing matters, camera-triggered gates matter because seeing exactly how many pigs are inside helps catch the full group. The objective is not to wound a problem. It is to erase a unit of learning before that unit carries the memory elsewhere. That is how smart the animal is. And still, for all that, the standard story remains adult-centered. Adults are what the helicopter spots. Adults are what the rifle tracks. Adults are what the camera most easily catches crossing an open lane at night. Adults are what the public imagines when it imagines feral hog control. The giant boar, the thick shoulder shield, the tusks, the charge, the visible threat. So when analysts began reconstructing what was actually happening after removal events, that bias came with them. The model was built cold from real categories of evidence: population estimates, range expansion, whole sounder control guidance, published damage studies, trail camera ecology, coyote diet papers, and field observations of predator overlap. The figures it returned were part of an illustrative reconstruction, not a government verdict, but the pattern was the important thing. It sorted landscape outcomes into two piles with startling consistency: places where hog pressure snapped back quickly and places where it did not. And the strongest signals were not the ones people liked talking about. Adult kills mattered. But adult kills did not dominate. The model kept surfacing three variables over and over: whether entire sounders were removed instead of partial groups, whether the landscape still protected the next generation, and whether local ecological pressure on juveniles had been ignored. That last part is where the footage starts to change shape. Because once you stop staring only at the adult hog, the rest of the system comes into focus. Farrowing cover, nest sites, movement corridors, scavengers, smaller predators, dawn windows, night windows, places where piglets are briefly exposed, places where exhausted sows are forced to choose between feeding and guarding, places where the future of the population exists in soft, vulnerable forms that never make it into the heroic version of the war. The machine match. When the model was asked to rank overlooked forces instead of obvious ones, it kept circling back to coyotes. Not as miracle workers, not as movie monsters, as pressure. Persistent, local, adaptive pressure. And that contradicted the emotional picture almost everyone carries. Coyotes are supposed to be side noise in this story. Opportunists, scavengers, a separate ranching problem. At most, a minor note in the margin. Texas Parks and Wildlife even states the mainstream view very plainly. Coyotes may opportunistically prey on immature wild pigs, but predation usually plays a minor role in overall hog mortality. On paper, that sounds settled. Then, the broader data starts talking. A 2025 diet study on an unmanaged coyote population in southern Texas found that wild pigs made up 14% of identified prey items in coyote dung, second only to white-tailed deer, 14%. In one of the most hog-saturated places in America, unmanaged coyotes were not merely brushing past the problem, they were interacting with it enough for pig remains to stand out in the diet. That does not mean coyotes are winning the war. But it does mean they are in the war. And once that number entered the system, the earlier footage stopped looking incidental. The infrared clips from post-removal landscapes, the coyote crossings, the repeated use of brush edges, the movement through zones where new farrowing would likely happen, the timing, the return timing after large-scale human pressure. The aftermath was not empty at all. It was crowded with a second process. Almost nobody had been measuring with the same obsession they brought to helicopter kill counts. If you want to see the moment this stops looking like simple pest control and starts looking like a systems failure, stay with me. It's close. Because the easy version of this story would now be to say, there, coyotes are the answer. Stop everything else. But the cold analysis did not say that either. It did something more unsettling. It compared Texas with another landscape entirely. In South Carolina, a USDA Forest Service study on wild pig and coyote overlap found high overlap in daily activity patterns, but no evidence that coyotes were strongly tracking wild pig presence. In that study area, wild pig was a minor piece of coyote diet, 5% or less across seasons, and the researchers did not find coyote activity to be a statistically significant predictor of wild pig site use. Same predator, same invasive species, different signal, that matters. Because it means the story is not a fairy tale about a single hero species riding in to save the day. The story is that the official one-size-fits-all explanation breaks the moment you test it across real landscapes. In some places, coyotes barely move the needle on hogs. In some places, they may matter more than managers assumed. In some places, adult-focused, human pressure dominates the picture. In others, juvenile survival and recolonization pathways appear to determine how fast the problem returns. The contradiction is not that textbooks were completely wrong. It is that the textbooks were too flat, and flat models fail in three-dimensional systems. Look at how people describe hog control when they are desperate. They say the same things over and over. We hit them hard and they came back. We trapped some and the rest vanished. We cleared one property and suddenly the neighbors had them. We pressured them and they shifted nocturnal. We pushed them and the damage moved. That is not just frustration talking. That is a behavioral pattern. Texas A&M warns that intensive hunting can cause feral hogs to shift home range or become more nocturnal. The official guidance on whole sounder trapping exists for the same reason. Break the group incompletely and you leave intelligence in the field. You leave memory. You leave animals that now associate structures, bait, timing, scent, engines, and pressure with danger. So the model took a second pass. Instead of asking what kills hogs, it asked what teaches hogs. That is a different question, and it gets different answers. Aerial removal can be devastating in the moment. Ground operations can be effective. Toxicants, when tightly controlled and used correctly, may reduce numbers on specific properties. Texas A&M's field evaluation of a warfarin-based toxicant reported that, under proper use, landowners saw sharp declines in hog numbers and damage. These are real tools, serious tools, useful tools. But useful is not the same as self-sustaining. Human control is episodic. It arrives in bursts. It depends on money, labor, weather, access, permission, and follow-through. Ecological pressure does not submit invoices. It does not wait for a grant cycle. It does not skip a month because fuel is expensive. It does not stop at a fence line because two landowners do not like each other. This is where the aftermath nobody expected starts to feel almost philosophical. After a major removal event, humans tend to interpret the landscape as a blank, a place temporarily reset. The model did not read it that way. It read aftermath as opportunity for recolonization, yes, but also opportunity for everything else in the system to reorganize around absence, carcasses, openings, and new vulnerability. And that includes predators, not as cinematic executioners, as accountants, cold, repetitive, nightly accountants of weakness. The old story wanted a single dramatic image, a giant boar charging through brush, a helicopter banking low over open country, a rancher with a thermal optic and a rifle over a truck hood. Those images are real. They are also misleading, because they keep our eyes fixed on the most visible, least scalable part of the cycle. The cycle begins earlier than the charge. It begins at reproduction. It begins at whether piglets live long enough to become the next wave. That is why the numbers on reproduction hit so hard. 2 litters in 12 to 15 months under good conditions. Populations capable of doubling in 4 months. 4 to 8 piglets on average, sometimes more. Once you run that forward, adult removal alone starts to look like a tax on the present, not a rewrite of the future. The machine did not like that arithmetic. In the reconstruction, when no labels were attached and the system was simply told to flag the most important predictors of rebound, the highest confidence conclusion it returned was not insufficient bullets. It was not insufficient helicopters. It was not even insufficient money. It was this. It does not stop at a fence line because 2 landowners do not like each other. This is where the aftermath nobody expected starts to feel almost philosophical. After a major removal event, humans tend to interpret the landscape as a blank, a place temporarily reset. The model did not read it that way. It read aftermath as opportunity. Opportunity for recolonization, yes, but also opportunity for everything else in the system to reorganize around absence, carcasses, openings, and new vulnerability. And that includes predators, not as cinematic executioners, as accountants. Cold, repetitive, nightly accountants of weakness. The old story wanted a single dramatic image, a giant boar charging through brush, a helicopter banking low over open country, a rancher with a thermal optic and a rifle over a truck hood. Those images are real. They are also misleading because they keep our eyes fixed on the most visible, least scalable part of the cycle. The cycle begins earlier than the charge. It begins at reproduction. It begins at whether piglets live long enough to become the next wave. That is why the numbers on reproduction hit so hard. 2 litters in 12 to 15 months under good conditions. Populations capable of doubling in 4 months. 4 to 8 piglets on average, sometimes more. Once you run that forward, adult removal alone starts to look like a tax on the present, not a rewrite of the future. The machine did not like that arithmetic. In the reconstruction, when no labels were attached and the system was simply told to flag the most important predictors of rebound, the highest confidence conclusion it returned was not insufficient bullets. It was not insufficient helicopters. It was not even insufficient money. It was this. Too much of the strategy was aimed at the most visible stage of the animal's life, and not enough at the stage that determines whether the population resets, piglet survival. The model's confidence on that point was brutal, 89%. Sit with that. Not because the number is sacred, it is an illustrative confidence score and a reconstructed analysis. Sit with it because of what it means. We built a war around the wrong image. We built it around the adult because the adult terrifies us, damages our property, and fills the frame. But the adult is not the future. The future is hidden. The future is small. The future is defended for a few crucial weeks, then dispersed into the brush. The future is what most control programs do not see until it is already running. And once that clicked, the post-massacre footage stopped being eerie and became obvious. Of course, the cameras kept catching movement. Of course, the story did not end with the shooting. Of course, the land was still negotiating with the next generation. The escalation came when analysts laid a second set of numbers beside the first. Not predator footage this time, economics. The US still spends enormous energy discussing how to remove hogs after they are already established. But study after study points towards scale, coordination, and timing. The livestock producer survey said bluntly that lethal control programs focusing on whole sounder removal are needed to reduce future threats. The crop damage work argued that the problem demands wide-scale control because wild pigs are mobile and fast-breeding. APRIS describes integrated programs precisely because no single tactic is enough. Now listen to what all three are quietly admitting. If the system has to be integrated, that means the single image solution never existed. If the system has to be wide-scale, that means property-by-property heroics are not enough. If the target has to be the whole sounder, that means partial victories may be feeding future defeats. And if local predator pressure changes the outcome in some landscapes, then killing or ignoring everything not named hog can blind managers to forces that were already helping. The story was never just shoot more. The story was always understand more. That is the part people resist, because understanding is less satisfying than force. Force feels clean. Force gives you a receipt. You can count bodies. You can film flights. You can post photographs. Understanding is slower. It requires that you admit the landscape knows things your program does not. It requires that you accept some of your pressure may be badly aimed. It requires that you separate what feels decisive from what actually changes the next season. And that is hard, especially when the damage is real, especially when livelihoods are on the line, especially when a rooted pasture, a broken irrigation line, or a plowed up field makes patience feel insulting. So let's be clear. Nothing in this analysis says ranchers should just stand back and wait for coyotes to solve feral hogs. The evidence does not support that. Mainstream wildlife guidance still says predation is usually a minor part of total hog mortality. Integrated control remains the standard for a reason. In many places, without trapping, aerial operations, and coordinated removal, the pigs simply win. But the cold analysis also says something the old story did not want to hear. The ecosystem is not neutral. And when you treat it as neutral, you make mistakes. You mistake visibility for importance. You mistake body count for long-term effect. You mistake a local victory for a regional one. You mistake all predators for noise. You mistake the aftermath for silence. Before I show you what the model found next, if you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this kind of moment when the data stops agreeing with the textbook. Because the final turn in this story is not about coyotes alone. It is about humility. When the model ran a third pass, it was asked to compare two management instincts. First instinct, hit what is biggest, loudest, and easiest to count. Second instinct, target the reproductive engine, the group behavior, and the ecological context that determine whether the next wave exists at all. The first instinct is human. The second is systemic, and systems beat impulses. That is why whole sounder trapping matters so much. Texas A&M's guidance on remote-triggered gates is almost eerie when you read it after everything else. Do not just catch some pigs. Wait, pre-bait. Condition the group. Watch the camera. Close only when the whole sounder is there. In other words, do not give the system a partial disturbance and call it success. Remove the learning unit. Remove the breeding unit. Remove the unit that will teach the next one. That is not brute force. That is pattern literacy. And suddenly the unexpected aftermath of a Texas hog massacre makes sense. The truly important footage was never only the footage of hogs dying. It was the footage recorded after humans left. The quiet clips, the return of motion, the species crossing the same corridors, the empty-looking brush that was not empty at all, the invisible stage where the next version of the problem was either being protected or being pruned. The machine saw that faster than we did because the machine was not emotionally attached to the adult hog as the symbol of the fight. It did not care about spectacle. It did not care about what looked dramatic in daylight. It cared about what predicted recurrence. And recurrence is the whole game. That is the phrase to remember. Not removal, recurrence. You can remove and still lose. You can kill and still lose. You can spend and still lose. You can fly and still lose. You can win the morning and lose the spring. Recurrence. That is why the most unsettling possibility in this entire story is not that people were doing nothing. It is that thousands of serious people were doing difficult, expensive, dangerous work and still aiming too much of it at the wrong layer of the problem. Not because they were foolish, because the frame was wrong. Once the frame changes, smaller details snap into place. Why local landowners pooling resources across properties can outperform isolated efforts. Why remote cameras matter more than old trap triggers. Why open, repeated pre-baiting changes outcomes. Why a coyote-rich landscape might behave differently from a coyote-poor one. Why a state or county can report impressive removal numbers and still feel like it is losing ground. Why one ranch can go quiet for a while and then explode again. Why a program that looks powerful from above can be less powerful than a quiet process, happening every dawn and dusk below. The model's second highest confidence finding was almost cruel in its simplicity. Treating feral hog control as a series of independent local fights guarantees that the animal's mobility will beat the human attention span. 84% confidence, again, illustrative. Again, based on a reconstruction built from real management and ecological literature. And again, hard to ignore. Because we already know the pieces. Wild pigs move, hunting pressure shifts behavior, partial trapping leaves educated survivors, population growth is explosive, control is most effective when coordinated. These are not controversial facts. The controversial part is putting them together and admitting what they imply. They imply that we have often confused activity with control. And activity can be very loud. There's almost something cosmic about that mistake. We do it everywhere. We mistake motion for progress, volume for accuracy, force for understanding. But ecosystems do not care how determined you feel. They only care which pressures persist long enough, broadly enough, and precisely enough to change what reproduces. That is the real reason the coyote suddenly matters in this story. Not because it is a magic bullet. Because it represents a kind of pressure humans cannot easily replicate. Continuous, local, adaptive, unpaid, present in the exact hours when no one wants to stand in a wet field watching a brush line. In some regions, probably minor. In some, maybe meaningful. In all cases, a reminder that the land is not waiting passively for our strategy to arrive. The land already has strategies, sometimes crude, sometimes insufficient, sometimes invisible until a camera catches them and someone finally bothers to look without assumptions. And that, more than the blood or the damage or the headlines, is what makes the aftermath of a Texas feral hog massacre feel so strange. The footage did not just record death, it recorded a handoff. Human pressure ends, ecological pressure continues. The old explanation treated those as separate worlds. The cold analysis says they are one world. The question is whether your management plan understands the handoff or keeps interrupting it blindly. Imagine standing in front of a wall-sized map of Texas at 2 a.m. 253 counties occupied, millions of hogs. Billions in damage and control costs. Decades of frustration. Now imagine dropping every story you have heard about the animal and reducing the whole crisis to signals. Breeding intervals, group size, county occupancy, trap design, movement response, predator overlap, damage recurrence. Then imagine the answer pointing over and over, not to a single dramatic action, but to a hidden bottleneck. The next generation. That is where the story narrows. That is where the future is decided. And that is why the most important image in this entire saga may not be a helicopter, a rifle, or a giant boar in daylight. It may be an infrared frame of brush in the dark after the loud part is over, when what remains on the landscape is not triumph, not closure, but a live negotiation over what comes next. The official story said the war was against hogs. The colder story says the war is against recurrence. Those are not the same thing. One is emotional. One is mathematical. One asks, how many did we kill? The other asks, what made the next season possible? And once you hear it that way, you cannot really go back. You start noticing how many environmental failures begin with the same visual trap. We fixate on the visible adult form of the problem because it offends us, scares us, or costs us money right now. Then we pour resources into striking that visible form while underestimating the hidden life stage, the background condition, or the secondary process that determines whether the thing returns. We do it with invasive species. We do it with disease. We do it with fires. We do it with information itself. We fight the frame instead of the engine. The feral hog crisis just makes that mistake impossible to ignore because the numbers are so obscene. 6.9 million in the US, 2.6 million in Texas, 253 occupied counties, populations that can double in 4 months, hundreds of millions in crop losses, hundreds of millions more in livestock and pasture damage, billions overall. If there were ever a system that punishes lazy thinking, it is this one. And still, in the middle of that scale, the most revealing clue may have been a small one, 14%. A coyote diet study in South Texas. One number that did not fit the public stereotype of a scavenger circling the edges. One number that did not prove salvation, but did prove participation. One number that forced the model to widen its lens. One number that helped expose how much of the fight had been built around what humans find easiest to witness, not what the system finds most consequential. That is what the footage really revealed. Not a monster, not a miracle, a blind spot. The aftermath nobody expected was not just carcasses or silence. It was evidence that the landscape was already doing work in the dark, while people were still arguing over the daylight version of the problem. Some of that work may be small, some of it may be local, some of it may be overwhelmed without serious human control. But it exists, it matters. And once you know it is there, management that ignores it stops looking tough and starts looking incomplete. So what does this mean, really? It means the older fantasy of total dominance over nature keeps failing in the same predictable way. We want clean enemies and clean solutions. The ecosystem keeps handing us interlocking pressures instead. We want one tactic. The land gives us feedback loops. We want a victory photo. The actual world offers recurrence curves. And maybe that is the deeper discomfort here. Not that feral hogs are winning, but that they are forcing us to admit how rarely we see a living system whole. For hundreds of years, the pigs adapted to us. In a few short decades, the control programs adapted to the pigs. And in the background, other species were adapting too. And the story never stopped moving. We just kept narrating the loudest part. What do you think this was in the end? A management failure, a pattern we noticed too late, or proof that the most important battles in an ecosystem happen where almost nobody is looking? Tell me below. And if you think there's more hiding in the data than we have been told, subscribe. The next one is already in the footage.